just want to say welcome to everyone for our ethical design panel discussion. We've got 5 panelists here today. I'm just going to go in the format that I see people on the screen. So I'll start with Schalk at the top. He's our first panelist. Schalk is a soon-to-be dad and a full-time freelance front-end developer and design thinker. He works on various personal, commercial, and open source projects. His focus lies within the worlds of user research, product design, and front-end development. Schalk has done consulting and contract work for National Treasury, the Google Foundation, Design Indaba, OpenUp, RunwaySale, and CSS-Tricks. Thank you for being on the panel today, Schalk.
Thanks for having me.
Cool. Next up, Karin. Karin has worked as a UX designer for the last 13 years. She's worked with banks, investment managers, insurers, a car manufacturer, a cinema, maker of luxury linen, fuel provider, and some strange loyalty programs, which we might need to ask you about. And most recently, a fun startup building a platform for businesses who have field sales teams. Karin believes that tech should serve people and that human-centered design makes the world a better place. Thank you, Karin. That's Karin. Next up is Vincent. Vincent's mission is to make work for everyone, for the good of humankind. Vincent is the co-founder of Better Work, a work design company that helps teams do better. Signal, a creative technology company that helps people live better, and the Good Work Society, a design guild advocating for dignified good work in South Africa. Thank you, Vincent, for joining the panel. We've got 2 more panelists to introduce. Lizette is next. Sure. Liz is head of design at DVT, and she's passionate about solving problems through human-centered design. She holds a master's degree in ethics and advertising, and is currently finalizing a PhD thesis on how human-centered design can benefit healthcare spaces. She's also the co-founder of DxZA. I hope I said that right, DxZA. We'll also ask you about that perhaps a little bit later. And then lastly, was that everyone? Sorry, am I missing somebody? Oh, Anu, sorry about that, Anu. Anu has over 20 years experience in the technology sector. She's an engineer and started her career as a software developer. She then transitioned to technology product management and worked for a number of companies ranging from startups to established corporates, excuse me. In 2016, Anu decided to follow her passion and founded Nedrock, a product management training and consultancy company. And that's it. That's our panel for today. And we just want to quickly address how we can handle Q&A. I think we'll start organically, and then as people have questions about the topics that we're talking about, we'll just handle the Q&A as we go along instead of having a bulk session at the end. Cool. We can start. Should we quickly just give a little bit of a lowdown of what ethical design actually is, and then run from there?
Maybe a good idea is to just go around and everyone kind of define like what they would consider as ethical design, because I think it is a very slippery term. Mm. Mm. So I guess it needs to start with me.
Off to you.
Well, I would actually, so the idea for this talk, I think it was actually initially your idea, Liesl. So I would actually like to, I'm actually interested in hearing what you would consider ethical design.
I think actually it was, we spoke about it just before you joined the call before this one. It was actually Justin's idea.
Okay, nice deflection. Justin, there you go.
But before Justin starts, we did also address this in the call before, and I was corrected. The moment somebody, or the first time I heard Justin say ethical design, I immediately went to inclusive design, and then thought that's down the wrong track. And Vincent corrected me, like that is all part of it. So I'm I can't say. I'm here to learn. So Justin, you can definitely start.
Okay, I wasn't expecting this.
Everyone's just deflecting until it gets to Justin.
Yeah, I did suggest this as a topic, and my initial thoughts around it were, geez, I'm trying to remember what I said in the earlier call because that was pretty succinct. You know, that there are lots of issues that we face as designers that relate to ethics, and you know, I'm particularly interested in not doing any harm, you know, and in particular, not doing any harm through the products that we build, and that's not just through the UX or UI decisions that we make, but considering the product as a whole. So looking at these things from a end-to-end point of view. What are the social ramifications? What are the political ramifications? What are the environmental ramifications? And how we can bring that into our process when making decisions. Yeah, that's all I'll say for now.
Cool. So I'm also happy to riff off that. So specifically for me, I know initially when we spoke about the topic and then the idea for this panel discussion, you know, we made kind of a distinction between, you know, when we talk about ethics, do we talk more in terms of what you shouldn't do? So do we talk about like dark patterns and those type of things, or do we talk about ethics in a more proactive sense? You know, like design solutions that are proactively making the world better. And so my thinking around it is I often find it problematic to speak about things that are, you know, proactively ethical, because, you know, like that is very subjective and slippery and needs a lot of like working definitions and so forth. So I find it often easier to just talk about like what we shouldn't be doing. And I think a lot of my thought around this topic is kind of influenced by two great books actually that both came out last year by Smashing Magazine. I don't know what their publishing site is called. I don't know. I think it's just called Smashing Books. I think Justin can correct me. So there's a great book that came out called Click, which speaks more to just conversion and, you know, essentially getting users to click on things. But then there's another great book called The Ethical Design Handbook. And I think my biggest takeaway from that is that when we talk about ethics in design, there's two aspects. There's kind of more related to how we conduct ourselves in direct interactions with people. So things like, you know, invoicing clients, intellectual property, everything from just and like user research, you know, do we do it in an ethical manner and so forth. And then on the other hand, there's kind of a more indirect way in which is kind of more related to the actual product that we build. That's more indirectly kind of how the product that we build is going to treat users, you know. And that's kind of a distinction that I find interesting. And my guess is, if I need to speculate, that we'll probably spend more time talking about the second one, which is more about the actual products that we build and the implications in terms of ethics around the products themselves, and not necessarily how we conduct ourselves in our day-to-day work. Yeah. So I'm also curious to kind of hear how the rest of you guys kind of think about this topic of ethics in design.
Can I maybe give two definitions that we can create like a kind of scaffold so we can build upon that? So ethics is about deciding how to act, so making judgments. And then justice is deciding whether that's fair, and then deciding if those decisions were fair. So ultimately, when we're having discussions around ethics, particularly within design, the question that comes to mind is, should we design? That's the first. If you think of the central thesis of ethics, which is how do we decide, and upon what basis do we decide? And there's kind of multiple approaches for decision making when it comes to ethics. Everything from utilitarianism to deontological approaches to ethics. So like deciding at the end is worthwhile versus like, say, for instance, making sure that you're diminishing harm. When it comes to design and ethics, maybe those two definitions can help everyone, which is just, it's as simple as that, right? Like, how do you decide to design? What informs that? How do you decide whether what you have designed is then in turn fair? So does it meet the ends of justice? And that, I think a lot of confusion comes out, particularly in younger people, which is that they confuse things like morality, religion, belief for ethics and justice. Those are distinct and non-overlapping ideas. Ethics is apart from your religion and apart from your morality, because you can be ethical and immoral relative to your own morality. In the same way that you could be called upon to design something that does not believe with, that does not map against your religion, and yet it can be ethical. And so these are the things that we must grapple with when we're thinking about design. And so I'm going to leave it there. I'm just going to say that there's the scaffold. I'm hoping that upon that we can build something interesting and maybe new questions emerge from that. My genuine hope is, because this is like my kind of life and the stuff that I've kind of give my brain to, is that the questions would emerge from the chat. But maybe those two scaffolds have helped you come up with questions, co-panelist or Justin or anyone who wants to chat. So that's me. I'm going to mute myself now and let the kind of space roll.
I'm gonna like take what you've said, Vincent, and sort of build on from there. So before I say anything, though, I feel like I have like this confession to make. So about 3 weeks ago or so, I put my hand up for this conversation, and I thought to myself, I don't really know anything about ethics theoretically, but I've always felt that my work as a user experience designer has a very specific goal and purpose, and that's why I do it. So that's why I'm saying it's sort of the why I design, is because I really believe that my responsibility is to design things that empower people, that don't make people feel stupid, that make people's lives better, that don't make them addicted to things that they shouldn't be addicted to, that doesn't do harm. And I've seen too much of that also in my work, because I've conducted so many usability tests with people, just observing them using all sorts of different digital products, and you see the stress and the anxiety. And I mean, I've been able to sit in sessions very neutrally and watch people get really freaked out and angry about this thing that they are trying to use. And it's not a product where they are trying to buy toys for their kids. It's a banking product. It's something where they need to save for their futures. These are important things that people really need in their lives. So for me, UX design has almost been a calling, and it's something that I'm really passionate about. However, when it comes to ethics, I'm pretty clueless. And so I told the panelists, I actually asked for permission to be on this panel because I am clueless when it comes to ethics. And I panicked a little bit. And then I tried to learn as much as I could about it. And what emerged very quickly for me is that the process that we follow, this idea of experimenting with things and getting it in front of people and just trying to build things so that they are usable and useful, is not enough. It's not okay. We really need to consider not only the users that we are designing things for and building things for, we really have to consider their families, their communities, and their environments. And that's a very difficult thing to do because Vincent, as you said, we as technologists, not only designers, so my background is more in engineering, we don't have the language for that. We don't have the frameworks to think about how do I not do harm, not only to this little person I'm designing for, but also to their extended community, and so on. And so I'm really grappling with this at the moment. And I was kind of hoping that we would have a bit of a conversation about that as well. Yes. I'll stop talking now.
Cool. Lizette or Anu, do one of you want to give your opinion?
Yeah, I'll go. So Karine actually invited me to this panel, and I don't come from a design background. So I come from a product management background. So just to put some context, why I got interested is I want to be part of teams that create good products, that create, and they don't cause harm in the world. And it really makes me feel, my heart sings when we hear about stories where, there is products, sometimes very intentional products out there that bring harm. And the way I've thought about it is, and I've always thought about it is, as product people, we want to help organizations create products that are valuable, usable, and feasible. However, I think there is a new element to it. It needs to be ethical as well. And that's what I'm thinking about now. Ethics needs to play a part in it. And when I work with organizations, we need to bring that conversation. And most organizations are not ready for that conversation. And how do we start talking about it? Raise the awareness around it. And I see two types of organizations, if we can, or products. They're really good products out there, and the intentions are good when people create the product. But there's some there's some consequences, unintended consequences. And when we work with teams, we need to kind of raise the awareness around it, because people only think about the happy part. We all, as humans, only think about the happy part naturally. So we need to start getting the optimists, like the developers and designers who are unaware. The outcome of the product is great and good. However, we need to think about, if we store data about our users and customers, is it safe? What if someone hacks into it? Those kind of things. That we need to raise the awareness of. And then there are actually products with pretty harmful business models, right? When you think about social media, we think about fintech companies, and startups that are under immense pressure from investors in terms of the metrics, which works against ethics. It really causes harm. And I just want to raise the awareness around it. When you interview at these organizations, let's be intentional about understanding their business models, because some business models should raise a red flag before you get in there. Think about it, because we've all been in difficult scenarios, and sometimes culture is hard to change, and then you need to walk away with your 2 feet. So yeah, that's kind of where I'm coming from. And it's like, I'm also very early stage in terms of understanding ethics, but I know I need to incorporate that in my work, and that's why I'm here.
Lovely.
Cool.
Thank you.
My turn. So I find it really interesting that quite a few people interpreted this topic very differently when it was initially just suggested. The idea that some people thought of it, in terms of, okay, how do I ethically go about my own work? How do I not introduce dark patterns? And then other people thought of, diversity and inclusion, and even then, going to business practices that are ethical. And I think what it comes down to is these are all different aspects of it. Like everything in our daily lives, you get into these situations where you start thinking, but is this an ethical thing to do? And sometimes you don't have control over that. When we were doing the sort of tech check beforehand, we actually started getting into a whole interesting conversation about what happens when your client is sort of forcing you, maybe as a junior designer, to do something that you feel is unethical, but it's essentially do this or you get a disciplinary hearing. How do you then decide that, actually earning my salary, maybe you have a family to feed? Like, at which point do you sacrifice your ethics or your morals in order to, still provide, and should you have to? It's a whole conundrum, and I think it's an important thing to talk about, because I do believe it's important for us as designers, as the people who are creating experiences in many cases, to actually stand up and say, actually, this isn't okay that you want to like lock people into a year-long contract where they have no way of opting out, for instance. It's not an ethical thing to do, but I once raised something similar with a client, and the response was, legal signed off on it, it's fine. And that to me gets to a very interesting crux, the idea that just because something's legal doesn't mean it's ethical. And I feel like those things very often get confused. I think Gauteng motorists will agree that even though e-toll is arguably legal, it's not necessarily ethical. And there are many other examples of that you can go into. But I think people, and that's what Vincent was also saying, like there are different sort of sets of things that people adhere to. Just because it might be technically allowable according to one set of rules doesn't mean that it's ethical, because ethics sort of transcends what is acceptable in your community. But it also means that it's subjective. What's ethical to one group of people might not be to another. How do we decide on that? And so that's in terms of like creating products, but I feel like it's an important differentiation to state. And now, before I take over the conversation, I think we've introduced everyone now. Yes, Liesel?
Yeah, everyone,
cool.
and everyone has given their opinion. I want to ask if anybody have a question at this point.
From the panel or
no, sorry,
in general?
In general.
So there's a couple in chat, so I think it might be worthwhile to relay them. I think I might now have a look and
just have a look, but it doesn't seem like they're actual questions. More comments.
Oh, so sorry, to Tessa's point, that's exactly like apartheid was legal. That is one of the good examples. And so child marriage is still legal in some places, but that doesn't make it ethical. But does anyone maybe have any questions that they want to ask us? Not that we necessarily know everything, but it might start an interesting conversation.
I have two that I would love to ask.
Go for it.
This is a really great opportunity for me because most of the time when I talk about ethical design, it's within the context of students and so forth. So I don't really get challenged on my views as much as I would like. And so I'm really hoping that I can get some people who maybe push back on some of my views and so forth. Because, you know, it is also, I think even the fact that we had to deliberate over like what exactly do we even mean just kind of goes to show like how little discussion there is actually on this, that, you know, even if we have a discussion, we need to make sure that what are we actually talking about. So I think two things for me. Let me just start with the questions and then maybe expand on them a bit. So I think a tension that I'm personally wrestling with, and I think even more so now that I like with the work that I've done with Codex and Google Foundation and so forth, is, you know, I think what I often find that as a lot of people that talk on these topics, including myself, you know, as well, tend to be in a very fortunate and privileged position. And I think being able to reflect on what you do and reflect on, you know, kind of ethical frameworks around that and so forth is a privilege that a lot of people don't necessarily have who are in survival mode, you know, who's just trying to make ends meet, trying to put food on the table and so forth. So there's that element, but also, you know, there are people who are just juniors and they don't necessarily have the what would be the word, like I almost want to say the technical and social capital to go against decisions. you know, and where does that leave those people? So I think one thing that's always bothered me is the type of people that have these conversations are people that are in a fortunate position where they have enough going for them, or they're trusted enough that they can just say, no, this is not good. And they don't need to risk repercussions. And the other thing that I want to ask, and this might sound like possibly a rhetorical question, but it's a sincere question. Has anyone done UX or product design or any whatever service design, like just this big ball of like related things, work where there wasn't an expectation that the money that you're going to get paid is going to cause whoever's paying you the money to make more money? And that sounds like almost cartoonishly evil, but I often find that that's what it comes down to. Like I've done a lot of work in the nonprofit field. I've actually been in the nonprofit field before I got into this field. And even with there, like it's the same principle, you know, at the end of the day, you need funders and you need to your product needs to grow to secure more funding and so forth. So you have those exact same temptations in terms of dark patterns and so forth. And yeah, I think, personally, for me, those are the areas that I find interesting. Is, you know, I can go on for hours about what I feel an ideal product should be, but how do we navigate the space where there is an expectation that what you're going to do is provide more value back than the person in, like, no one's going to pay you to design something expecting that to not have any real effect. Cool. So, like, just to summarize, my two questions is, what do we make? Do we feel it's problematic that there aren't as many voices on this topic that aren't as established within the field? And what do we kind of make of just the fact that at the end of the day, we are getting paid to do something and that thing should provide value, which places us in a problematic position if the ethical thing is going to decrease value. So I think those are maybe the two things that I'd maybe broadly just throw out there and run away.
I'm gonna go in. I'll dive in with the provocation first, and then try and work my way around the topic. Yeah, I did warn some of you that I'd be provocative. The design education has failed us. That's my provocation to all of you. If you've been educated in design in the last 15 to 20 years, it's very likely that you've not picked up any courses on philosophy, jurisprudence, justice, ethics. You've primarily focused on tooling, you're primarily focused on the visual artifacts, and you're primarily focused on workflow design. The things that I believe fundamentally that machines can do. So let's say that. So that I tell this with some conviction, because I'm watching the professions of law and accounting have the large chunks of their work being automated by machines. So don't tell me that for 1 second wireframes can't be done by a machine, like, or UI or interface design. Machines can do that too. So let's say that for that reason, most designers cannot, for 1 second, have the kinds of conversations they should be having about justice and ethics, because then they're all ill-prepared for doing so. So let's go to your first question around representation, like representation in the room. It's a given. So we chatted about this, Corinne. We chatted about ethics being inclusive and diverse. It's a mandate for organizations, if they wish to be ethical, to increase the number of lenses that are applied to the design process. You cannot, because we imbue products and services with our values, we cannot believe that one type of person can successfully imbue products with a wide diversity of values. And then on your second question, which is, I think, the more contentious one, which is like, what if I'm starving and I need to design? So I'm going to stop that. Right, like, I'm going to say that Victor Papanek in the 1970s called upon design to be radical, like radical. If you're willing to be a designer, and I think this points to Mike Montero's points around, do we need licensing for design? When we design, we become gatekeepers for what society can and cannot use. We take responsibility for what shapes society, And Marie Willis spoke about this a lot. We design the things that in turn design us. We take a moral and ethical responsibility when we do that for how people live in the world. If you're not willing to say no and set aside your own happiness, then I'm not sure you should be a designer. And that takes something tremendously powerful from you to set aside your own needs, such that you say no every single time something unethical comes before your desk. I'd rather you be poor and starving than continue to create unsustainable, wasteful, unethical products. Like, I know that and I said I'd be provocative, right? Like, but I fundamentally believe this. The second thing I think you all need to know is John Edelman's done some really interesting research on this. A large part of his research points out that 60 to 70% of modern consumers now are shopping with ethics in mind from the get-go. So I think you just need to park the fact that you'll be poor for a couple of weeks. That consumers are going to change. We're already seeing this. So I'll give you two examples, right? Nike. So Dylan will come back to this, right? Like it's a standpoint from my side that poverty is an unethical move. Sure. Not everyone asked to be a designer, but when you called yourself designer, you took on that role, such that you took on this responsibility. Nike and Puma are both trying to create sustainable products. Why? Not because they're inherently ethical, because we're demanding that they become that way. So my suggestion to you is, if you do feel like that at the moment in your design practice, know that the future is changing. Know that there are communities of practice that are obsessed by sustainable futures. Know that there's widespread acknowledgement from young people that they don't want to F up the climate any more than we already have. We don't need to be what Mike Montero calls the lost generation of design. We actually do get a choice. We get a choice every time we say yes and no to a project. The tragedy I find is that most designers are not willing to take on any discomfort on their side to be ethical, even though when they know better. And I see this in banking a whole hell of a lot in South Africa. And I'll eventually end up, I'll finish talking just now, I promise. But on most banking websites in South Africa, you can sign up for credits. If you earn a 5,000 to 6,000 rand, you can sign up for a loan for a Jaguar. See, Karine, your kid coming into view reminds me why this is so bloody important. Like, I have a 3-year-old daughter. This couldn't be more important. Those of you saying yes to unethical projects right now are jeopardizing Karine's child and my child's future. And I will hold you to account for that. I'll find you. I'm not even kidding. I will find you, and I will say that if you are building risky credit products, or if you're building products with dark patterns, if you're building with intention and you're leaving out bystanders of design, then I say to you that Karine and my kid will definitely blame you. Sorry, now I'm done with my provocation, and the room can ask lots of questions, and I'm done. I apologize. I thought I would just give the room some chance to ask questions and maybe challenge me.
I just want to quickly say, I'm so glad. I was hoping that Vincent was going to take that. I'm so glad you did. I really appreciate it.
You knew he would. Vincent likes the provocative side of things, but that's why we like having him here.
But I just wanted to connect with one thing that Vincent said, which is kind of also connected to what Anu was saying earlier about understanding your clients' business models. Ethics, I think ethics in product doesn't belong to one role. It doesn't belong to a single person or a single level. It needs to belong to the entire business, which is why it's kind of, as designers, Vincent, we don't have the right skill set yet. We don't have the right language. And we're not standing up, I think, enough at the table to say that when I design this thing, I need to understand where the money is going to come from to fuel it. It's not good enough just to take on that sort of naive pose where you say, I want to make the world a better place and create these usable products. Yes, you do need to create usable products, but where is the money coming from? And what is the ultimate goal of the business that you are designing these usable products for? And it is quite scary, I have to say, with kids. If you really start listening to what's being spoken about in terms of ethics at the moment, and how humanity's ability just to focus on a single thing for longer than 4 minutes at a time. I think it's gone down from 4 minutes to like half a minute at a time. Yes, it is quite scary if you've got kids then, because we need to rethink the way we design things and how many interruptions, for instance, we build into the things that we design. And now I am going to stop because Jack is starting to talk now.
So I want to jump in there and like answer something that Vincent was talking about in terms of the responsibility of a designer. And I agree completely. Being a designer, it comes with a massive responsibility because we have an entire tool set at our disposal. And I know you hate talking about tools, Vincent, but we have a tool set at our disposal and we have a platform where we can affect real change or we can inflict real harm. And I think people very often don't think about this enough. And for that reason, I find it incredibly, incredibly dangerous that design is becoming very accessible to non-designers. And there's a whole debate in that topic itself. Because yes, on the one hand, it's very good for non-designers to learn about design, about the philosophy that goes into it, about the way that we approach things. But there's inherently a problem with teaching people a design thinking toolkit, which is step 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, executing that with the nice methodologies of sticky notes and all of that, but they don't understand what they are actually inherently doing. They're following all the steps, they're getting a product, they're creating it, they're doing it, but there is no deeper understanding of how that is actually going to affect their community, how that's actually going to affect the people they're designing for. They have a product, they have an outcome, cool, the shareholders are happy because design thinking works. But I think it's very, very dangerous when people start using design toolkits without really understanding what you can do with this. I saw someone in the comments said something earlier about, now I'm going to completely forget what it was, but just this idea that we're creating things that is allowing people to use our language and use our toolkits and create things, but they don't understand the deeper meaning. And I think that's inherently a very big problem. Creating design as something that is, you know, like a guild you need to belong to, or whatever you want to call it, professional body, like you do with architects and lawyers, etc. There's a whole debate about, you know, whether that should be done for design itself, because traditionally design has been, you know, a soft skill or whatever you want to call it, that shouldn't be governed as tightly. But when you really understand the power of design, you understand that actually we need to be careful of what we're teaching people and how they are applying those. Because yes, the more principled designers who genuinely understand what we're doing might be saying no to projects because we find them unethical, but you will always find someone that will pick them up because they're not as ethical, because they're not actually, there's someone who can execute the trade, but they don't give a damn about the implications of the people, which is actually kind of, to a large extent, I would argue, what design is about. End of my rant. Next.
Does anybody want to comment on that?
Yeah, I'm always happy to just go on. So I think I would maybe disagree with you, Lizette. I think actually like the almost, I don't want to use accessibility here because to me, accessibility means something else. But let's say the democratization of design, I think happened like a long time ago. Actually, I think like that was with the advent of desktop publishing. So I think since then, that like the fact that anyone can claim to be a designer is just a fact of life. Whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, I don't know. Like I also don't really think going back to kind of the pseudo technocracy that we had before, where you kind of like design kind of like was this inner circle that you had to know the right people and whatever. I don't know whether that was better, but yeah, I actually don't know. But like, I actually just think like this has happened a long time ago. But I think what I actually wanted to comment on specifically, and I think this is maybe also in response to a lot of things that Vincent said, you know, like I would consider myself also pretty radical in terms of just like, I almost want to say my disappointment in humanity at large. And yeah, like I also have a daughter coming in September. So like I feel you guys. But I think one thing we need to be cognizant of is that, you know, when we talk about ethics and we talk about unethical behavior, there's a spectrum here. You know, like on the one hand, we essentially get what would be like just borderline scams. You know, you think you sign up for something and then you get like, it's literally just one level above like literally being illegal. But then like between there and just the place of, I don't want to say neutral design, because I don't necessarily think there is something like a design that's just completely neutral, but even just up until the point where the design doesn't do that much harm, there's an entire spectrum of things, including things that just are inconvenient, you know, that just like one of the good examples is Amazon. You know, like I don't know if you guys have ever actually watched the video. If you go to darkpatterns.org, like the first example is on Amazon, and like the steps that you need to go through to delete your account on Amazon, it is just absurd, and it's very clearly built to make it almost impossible to delete your Amazon account ever. So, you know, so you get like this entire spectrum of where you start getting more into the world of just inconveniencing users and not communicating clearly with users, setting expectations in terms of what's going to happen now and so forth. And I think that also makes it hard, you know, like, because I think I think like on all the things that you mentioned, I completely agree with that. And I think we, as someone who also comes from a formal design background, we need to account for just like how miserably we failed. And I think that's, you know, especially in terms of the ecological crisis. But I think from there's a spectrum of just like gray area things, like what do we do with those? Do we there also just draw a line and say, you know, you need to take a stand here, even put your job at risk, even if that means, you know, you're not going to be able to support your family? I think those I find interesting, and I have no idea what the answer is, but I think it's a good discussion point.
I wanted to mention something on that also. So in my panicky state of preparing for this talk, I somehow managed to get a conversation with a man called Kenneth Bowles, who wrote a book called Future Ethics. And it was a really tough conversation. And we were speaking at the level of regulation, almost, of governments having to regulate things, and how different countries in the world are looking at ethical design. So for instance, apparently in the Scandinavian countries and in Germany, governments regulate how things are allowed to be built, how you are allowed to build things on the internet. In the US, they don't do that because it's not good for business. In China, they do that, but China, they over-regulate things, but that's a whole other ball game. And so we were talking about these really big concepts and ideas. And at some point in time, I said to Kenneth, but what about startups? How do you bring all of these really big ideas back into the startup space? And he kind of paused and he said, he doesn't know how we do that, because startups don't have the resources actually to bring in expensive, I suppose, ethical thinking. Because right now, at this point in time, thinking about ethical design is a specialized kind of a thing to do, Vincent, sort of coming back to that thing of we don't have the tools, generally speaking, and so Kenneth was saying he operates at sort of enterprise and big business level, and he tries to make ethical changes happen from the top, kind of downwards rather, just because of this thing where it's so hard to survive and be ethical at the same time, right? I'll stop.
Cool. Just a few things came to mind. I think there's a few comments on the chat, actually, who's responsible for this, right? Ethics. And I think that's a big one. So if I think about it, it takes different kind of skills to create a product. And I heard the word design a lot. There's product management, there is the developers. Now, if it's everybody's job to make sure something is ethical, if it's everybody's job, nobody's head is on the line, and probably it won't be effective, right? So that's, I've seen it in so many different organizations and different skills. If you say it's everybody's job, nobody's going to be accountable at the end of the day, and probably it's not going to be effective. That's a comment I'm going to make. The second comment I'm going to make is, how many UX courses and how many product management courses talk about ethics? Think about it. I haven't seen any. Let's think about the educational aspect of it. Are people even aware of thinking about it? And the third thing I want to ask is, what is the incentive, right? So, we have OKRs in organizations, and there is an incentive to get to a certain metric. What is the incentive for ethics? Shouldn't there be some sort of incentive from an organizational perspective? So I added those few comments, and keen to hear what your thoughts are around that.
So I'd say you make an interesting point, like what's the incentive to do it? And unfortunately, I think traditionally we've seen that companies often just don't care because it doesn't make the money to be ethical. However, I can't remember who mentioned it earlier, there is a drive amongst like the younger generation, and well, hopefully our generation as well, but Generation Y, I can't remember what they're called, I think the Generation Y, there's a very big drive to be more ethical, to be more sustainable, to actually care about the environment, to care about your community, things like that. And that is forcing companies to actually be more ethical and create, products that are sustainable, etc., because it makes them money. So I don't know, I don't know if companies would actually, there are some companies that do have that like as an intrinsic thing. Most just subscribe to capitalism, and as long as they're making money, they don't necessarily care if it's unsustainable or unethical. And I think it's important for people to hold them accountable, but as with everything, they only really start caring when it, to a large degree, starts affecting their bottom line. Maybe I'm just being very cynical. I'd love to hear someone else's point of view that's maybe slightly less cynical.
And I maybe just say, can we maybe just cut to the chase and start talking about capitalism?
Yeah, someone asked that right at the beginning, like, how are you actually ethical in a late stage capitalist society?
Because this is where this is going to
end. Oh, no, Vincent did warn us that he's going to start smashing the screen.
So there's a couple of things that I want you to think about maybe. Who's responsible for capitalism? Not you guys. Right?
No, us.
Not you. Not because we speak about it in an abstract way. Late stage capitalism as if it's this thing that exists outside of us. So if you want to change a system, change your action, change your purchasing behavior, change how you connect and relate to other people. Like I'm very nervous of people who don't take accountability in that. Like the whole of Twitter can basically bugger off for that reason. It's very easy to go onto Twitter and say, "Oh, capitalism," and then not recognize that you are a actor in capitalism.
And the second thing, of course, is I think that, to me, we talk about organizations in the same way, as if there are entities that we don't have any stake in. There are things that operate on us and we don't operate in them. So we talk about organizations having a body of ethics, organizations being commercially orientated. Who, and I'm sorry I'm being provocative again, but who exactly runs those companies? Is it non-humans? Because we talk about them as if they're abstract entities that just, they're like the Borg and they work on us. Lisa Gill writes a really interesting book. I think it's called something like Mooseheads in the Boardroom, in which she talks about this idea of reorientating how people think about themselves in the workplace, moving them from consumers of organizational patterns to producers of patterns. You must recognize when you're in an organization, it doesn't exist without you. You are a part of the material of an organization. To that end, I don't believe for 1 second designers have no power. You can, for instance, I mean, let's get immediately practical about this, because I think many people might want to know, like, how the hell do you start making this practical? You could start meetings by talking about the unintended consequences of our design, simply signaling what might happen if we fail. Like, just doing that kind of gesture is not that brave, but it could actually change the way that your stakeholders, the ones who are paying you money, think about your product. And yet I don't hear it at all. So I eavesdrop on design conversations all day. Like, I don't know what's wrong with me. Palesa, who's still on the call, and I we're very lucky that we work on organizations. So we hear designers, we hear people like you guys, all of you in the room, working, and we're not in your process, which is why I asked who can hold the ethical space. We're outside of the space, shielded somewhat from the economics of the work itself. You know what we never hear designers doing? Surfacing tension that is obviously that they're feeling in that moment. There is zero bravery in that. To sit there in the room and listen to a client and say, wait a minute, I could ask a question that helps them like kind of explore this from a different way of thinking. Donella Meadows speaks about this idea of asking questions from the new paradigm that might help you shift to that new. So as a simple example, which might be like, we're designing this really crappy thing right now. What would it look like if we were to design a credit lending process that actually maximized the well-being of the people who took credit? A simple question like that feels really harmless until you ask it in the room with the people paying for the work. They can go home that night in the car and deeply confront the fact that they are doing that. What I see a lot of is designers doing the most nefarious kind of critique at the canteen, in the corridors, speaking about the elephants in the car, moaning to their friends on Twitter about late stage capitalism, going to like safe places on Slack groups and saying, oh, look at my client, they suck. Aren't we meant to be the society that's more compassionate and sympathetic than most? Isn't that why we got into design? Aren't we meant to be empaths? Isn't that the first part of design, to be empathetic? Can't go around talking about our clients like this. Again, I'm being provocative, and that's all I've got really. So maybe if I can very quickly about practice, because I get it. You're all dealing with this. I don't know how Palesa and I got so lucky that we get to choose the work that we do. My suspicion is that we're coherent when it comes to our values. That these are the things that are there is a waterline, and you cannot go past that. And even if you tried, we're not going beyond it. And that the clients that have come to us now actually want more of that. And Palesa, who's here, thankfully, can call my BS. I would say for the first 6 to 7 years of our design firm's life, we were putting more money into it than it was giving us. And so therefore, one has to agree, though, that long-term it was worth it. Like I'm chilled and I enjoy my work and I don't feel pressured by this stuff. So like to bring it back to the point, right? Like, how the hell do you do this? How do you confront this tension? My suggestion is a couple of things. One, you form niches in your organization, which are safe places to go and speak. They're shielded by the economics. So like, don't think that in the design process, you need to confront ethics constantly. Set up a tangential process where you can talk about ethics, about your project in an abstract way. Do that with your clients in the room. Do that in these kinds of forums. You're already doing this, right? Some of you might even be clients one day. Many of you are dreaming about being client side, let's be honest, because that's where it pays. The The second thing is you own the space in design. Designers seem to have forgotten this. We come from a legacy of designing interactions, and yet we don't think about the design process as a series of interactions we can design. We're obsessed by ideation, like methodologies, and obsessed by like sense making and inquiry-based interactions. Do you think anyone does that kind of intentionality about the brief, about talking to clients, about how we email our clients, about how we talk, like how we correspond with them about our ethical values? No, there's almost zero intentionality about that. And yet those are the places and the domains for us to actually start to surface things like our ethical quandaries or ethical values. And it will be eventually be profitable, right? Like, so we're just going through a weird transitionary period where it's gross and uncomfortable, but at some point it'll feel like that, and all our clients will be talking about this way too. Anyway, I thought I would share those moments to kind of round it back to the point. You have a tremendous power in the interactions of the design process to surface very difficult ethical conversations. The practice of that is to be better at asking questions. The kinds of questions that stump a client in their tracks without making them say, wait a minute, I'm not going to give you this work. Just to think. And the second thing is you can in fact create spaces in almost every organization that are already there, where we begin to talk formally and intentionally about ethics. And that's going to require a couple of things. Most people, I believe, don't have any capabilities and capacity to have a really good conversation about ethics and justice. They haven't bothered to do any reading. They wouldn't, for instance, know that there is a framework for ethical decision-making that's quite rigorous, that you can work through an ethical challenge in a very easy and comfortable way. And so I'm going to stop speaking now because people are leaving as I speak. I mean, Chris left just because of me. Chris, I'm so sorry. Flip.
Hey, I also have to say, Chris is a student of mine, so I think I need to kind of step in here and back off, Vincent. Leave my students alone.
So you've done well here. Chris has asked really good questions. So whatever the hell you're doing in class has resulted.
I gave him the script. But I think that's maybe a nice segue, and maybe this is a good opportunity for me to hog more speaking time. I think so. I'm so torn in two because, I hear these things about, creating ethical teams and whatever. And, and then I'm like, I get like super excited and I'm like, because this is, I think this is what all of us want. But then on the other hand, and I think Justin can maybe relate to this quite a bit as well, because, I work within this space, but I also tend to work within the more technical side of software as well. And just when I look at something like accessibility, which is essentially just the principle of, making people with who are less able, so whether that's being blind or, visual impairments or whatever, be able to use our products, that's not even something that is contradictory to the actual business model itself. You're going to sell more products, you're going to increase your actual user base. But just how hard that is to kind of even put up for discussion. I teach quite a bit, and I always try and really work accessibility into all the material I teach, and I've gotten a lot of pushback to that. Not publicly, but in private, and no one's ever going to say screw less able people, they shouldn't use our product, it's always more subtle, and I just find that so disheartening. And then I almost there's a part of me that's just so I almost want to say defeatist, where I'm if we can't even do that, how would we ever just take on something like just the way teams are organized at the moment and the incentives? I don't really know whether that's a question. It's maybe just me kind of getting that off my chest. But I'm pretty sure Justin kind of shares, specifically around accessibility and so forth, kind of shares those concerns. And my hunch here is that I did mention, there is a financial incentive to that, but the problem is that, it's just this thing of like, I never remember what the term is called, but it's kind of like this, the 20-80 rule, you know, that, you know, 20% of whatever is going to provide 80% of the value, and 80% of something is going to provide 20% of the value. Whether that's true or not, you know, that's kind of a very standard kind of like business axiom. And I think that's kind of the thing. It's not necessarily that people don't want to spend resources on accessibility. It's just in terms of opportunity cost. I think we are so just focused on efficiency and just, you know, if we can get 5 more users by making things accessible, or we can get 100 more users by having like some fancy Facebook marketing campaign, then we're going to go for 100 users. And I think, yeah, like, I don't know, like that, those type of, like, even those type of interactions always leave me like extremely discouraged. So I think my hope here is that someone's going to tell me like, no, Schalk, you're actually missing the point. There's a lot to be optimistic about. So I think that's my question. Can someone please do that for me? Please, Justin, not you, because I know you share my concerns here.
I'm probably just going to rehash something that Vincent said earlier on about the shape of your team determining the shape of your product. And I think if your team contains enough people who need their designs to be accessible, then this problem will go away. But we're just not there yet, right? And so I don't know. I'm turning 40 this year, guys, and I think when you turn 40, your eyes just really go bad. And I've seen this in my friends, and then all of a sudden, accessibility becomes a really, really important thing. And then I look at the people that I work with, and I look at all the developers, and they're all young. Like I don't know why this is, but it's a thing. Like the developers are all in their 20s, and some of them in early 30s, and they don't get it, right? And that's why we have to be more intentional about building more diverse teams in terms of all the things, in terms of gender and race and culture and religion and political views, but also just in terms of age. And that probably sounds a little bit humorous, but it's something that I feel quite strongly about because because of many personal stories, which I will not share right now, but it is a thing. So Schalk, I don't think you should be defeatist. I think you should be optimistic that we're having conversations like these where we're saying our teams are not diverse enough. Our teams are not inclusive enough. And if they become inclusive enough and diverse enough, then perhaps your accessibility mission and vision, you know, will be met one day. So I think I hope that helps a little bit.
I just quickly want to respond to that, and then I'm going to shut up because I've also spoken quite a bit. But yeah, that's an excellent point. I always say, you know, I always go through, you know, like just a lot of these things, why even care? And one of the reasons is just like, I think a pretty selfish reason is that I want to still use the internet when I'm like really old. And, you know, we're probably going to be one of the first generations where once you're like in your 80s or whatever, you would probably still want to use the internet. And like, I wouldn't ever want to reach a point where I'm like, okay, I think my eyesight is like mostly gone to shit now. And sorry, am I allowed to swear? I think fine. That was the first swear word. My eyesight
floodgates now, and I am now excited.
All right, now Vincent is gonna go. So my eyesight is gone, and you know, like I'm just like I need to make peace with the fact now that this beautiful relationship I had with technology and the internet is done, and you know, now that part of my life is over. I don't want that. So you know, it's in my interest to start now creating a culture that when I reach that point, like that is not. That like the internet isn't in the state that it is now. But like I think this brings me to the last point I maybe want to make. I often find with these type of discussions, one thing that often doesn't get touched on quite enough is just like the technical aspect to these things. And I don't want to go too much into accessibility, but I also think, a lot of this can be drawn to broader ethical questions as well, is that even if there was a desire to build things in an accessible manner, the way the teaching material out there, just general cultures and whatever, even if everyone tomorrow decide, hey, we want to start building accessible things, I don't think the skill set is there. And I'm pretty sure Justin would agree with me. I just, and you mentioned, all those young developers and so forth. And that's a problem. Like, the entire organization can decide, hey, we want to focus on accessibility or whatever. But at the end of the day, it's that person with the technical knowledge to be able to say, I technically know enough about this part of the thing that we're building that I know this is going to be a problem. And I think this applies to everything, whether it's like ecological concerns or whatever. You probably need someone with a pretty good technical understanding to say, hey, this part of the process is actually pretty bad for the environment or whatever. So I often find that we neglect like the importance of just the technical know-how in these discussions, and I'm maybe kind of actually contradicting myself here, because I spoke quite a bit about the will not being there, but it's not always just the will. It's like sometimes the skill sets are just not out there, and those are not the people that are involved in discussions about ethics. But with that being said, I'll mute myself because I'm curious what the rest of you think.
I've got a comment I'd like to make. As much as we think that ethics is the responsibility of big stakeholders and designers, it's also the user that needs to be educated. Like what is treading over the line for me and getting rid of those products, because that's how the guys at the top are going to feel it. Like that's where it's going to hurt. If you stop shopping on Amazon, if you stop using Facebook, but it has to happen in bulk. I see you frowning, Vincent. So it's maybe a weird statement that I'm making, but I think people need to understand what boundaries and ethics they have in place. And if they don't agree with it, take it out of your life. Does that make any kind of sense?
I worry that is a form of not taking accountability for the fact that we have designed the spaces that in turn design us. It's like we made Amazon. And I say collectively because it's designers. So I don't want to talk about the fact that like Amazon hired designers that are, I don't know, Amazon designers. But if Jeff Bezos called one of you now and said like, hey, I'm looking for a new product designer, keen for you to come and join us. The pay is $200,000 and I'll help you move. My suspicion is the next answer is like, there's a flight on Friday at 7 o'clock. So exactly what time would you like me to leave? And we would find ourselves in that organization making some difficult decisions. I'm worried about not taking accountability for us to make those choices. So here I present one way to think about that. I'm sure many of you have become tangentially interested in behavioral economics. Or maybe a little bit right, because it's like that. It's kind of like now it's the shit in design, in the design world. Behavioral economics relies on a single quite powerful idea. It's this idea of liberalistic paternalism. This idea that there's a free market, but we can be paternalistic in that free market as people who design the things that shape us. So how does this play out? And this is why I say that consumers don't have as much choice as they think they have. We decide what is in the aisles of the shopping market. We decide what is in the basket of your goods on Takealot. We make a decision as to what you can choose by changing the menu. Consumers don't have as much free will as they think they do, because designers have made the menu for them. So the question is, what is in the menu? Like, what do you put into the menu? What is the values of the person who's building the menu itself? Like, you read like Nudge and some of the work around behavioral design, and you realize that once you give the game away as to how the frailties of the mind, to Danny Kahneman's point that we're predictably irrational, or like many people in design now are obsessed with cognitive biases, we spot these frailties and then we operate on them. I'm disgusted and horrified by that, because designers should know better. So sorry to put a finer point in this. I think, Liesel, like, I agree, consumers probably should be educated, but then maybe we should design the tools that educate them. So it should be built into the systems themselves. So for instance, a simple way of doing this, if we were to be paternalistic about this, is when someone is on a website like Takealot, having Moby credit at the next door to it, where you're effectively saying you can't afford this now, but I'm going to spread the value of this purchase over the next 12 months, and I'm going to get you indebted for the rest of your life so that you can have this crap that you don't need. Designers chose that. They put it in the perfect place. Like, I don't know, it like gets me down so much. But I don't want to be the ultimate pessimist, because we could in that moment have chosen something else. So in other words, for instance, in every time we design a menu, we could design a better menu. Victor Papanek actually talks about this quite a lot. It's a difficult one to bring up in the modern age, because he speaks about this idea that designers designed the hamburger. Like, we made the McDonald's burger. We don't talk about designers in other spheres, in other works of life, but people who make food, chefs, are designing. And he talks about the fact that designers should take account for the lack of health in society. Because we made things that are addictive, that people want to eat desperately. We made the containers that took the 1.5 liter Coke because we know someone would buy it. We made that choice available to someone. So it's hard. We take those decisions for society. It's tough. And that's why I say I don't want to allow us to not be accountable for that. I wish I had a question to end talking. I feel like I'm making statements, which disappoints me.
I agree with you 100%. I'm a firm believer in your own locus of control. So, you know, if you stand in front of that 2-liter bottle of Coke and you damn well know you shouldn't be buying it, you still do it because a designer put it in a bottle, you are giving away your own power. So all I'm trying to say by that statement is educate yourself. If you feel like, I mean, discovery is for me probably the worst of, like, just, I wouldn't touch it with a stick. And if you feel like you should not be going there, don't go there. And, you know, at the end, you know, I mean, I know it's going to take a long time, but people will have to, the bigger companies will have to start rethinking their actions. And I think discussions like this is a great start. And yes, there's a big responsibility on designers, but us as a user can also take responsibility by saying, no, you know, like, I'm not going to stand for this.
It's an interesting one. There's I'm just trying to get this guy's name right. Jack Elliott. He dubs this term called informed negligence for what designers do. So we know the right thing to do, but we choose not to do it. So the right thing to do would be probably not to design the container for the 1.5 liter Coke, and yet we do it. It's like,
can I
probably
just jump in there randomly? Yeah. Someone just mentioned on the comments that Jeff Bezos actually announced today that he's stepping down on the 5th of June. And continue.
Yeah, so Barry's asking some really good questions regularly. Barry, games are an interesting one, right? Like, particularly when it comes to fantasy and fiction. To what extent do designers actually agree that they're going to produce the games that what is the word that you use? Predatory design principles, that have predatory design principles. I'm horrified that we were put in a position where we had to make those choices. There are sorry, I'm just going to answer like some of these questions because people are shouting at me now, which is great. I guess that's the point of provocation. I learned so much from Dave.
Sorry, Vincent, while people are shouting at you and to everyone else, I have to go and
bye, Jack.
Into bed. And this was really cool, and I feel like we need a follow-up session, and I'm going to have serious FOMO as I put him into bed. So, but thanks, guys.
We are recording, so you can watch the rest.
Okay, awesome. Cheers, bye.
Thanks, Corinne.
Thank you so much. Would you mind if I answered some of these people that are shouting at me?
Absolutely. Go.
Vincent, do you mind if I just mention something around this gaming thing?
Yeah,
absolutely. I came across this week.
I'm so glad that you're talking. Like before this, I was saying to Justin that like I was sad that he wasn't on the panel because I would have loved to have picked his brain. Now you're here. Great.
Okay. So I don't know if anyone saw this Intel AI tool called Bleep that they unveiled last month. So did anyone see this? No. It's bizarre to me. So this is to me, a designer trying to solve a problem and failing spectacularly. So we all know that online multiplayer games are hot cesspools of misogyny and racism and, you know, the worst things you can think under the sun. And it's usually some 12-year-old calling you whatever. So this Bleep tool is supposed to mitigate your exposure to racism, homophobia, misogyny, etc. But it works with a slider. And you can have, sorry, I'm just going to check my notes here. You can have none, some, most, or all. And the categories you can apply this to are racism, misogyny, homophobia, and the N word. So you can actually go into this with this AI tool and say, yeah, I'm cool with racism. Give me all of it, you know, or yeah, homophobia. Yeah, I'd like a bit of that, but not too much. Just give me a bit, you know. So here's this idea, and this is coming, and the idea behind this is we're going to solve these problems, but we're not going to get rid of individual human agency. And what do you end up doing there? Because no one wants to, you know, just toggle racism. You know? And the idea behind this is like, oh, we're solving these massive social and political issues, but you're not doing anything whatsoever. If anything, you're normalizing them. Because you're saying, yeah, if you want to choose racism, that's absolutely fine. And that becomes a design decision that I can't get my head around within this kind of gaming context, because you know, these online multiplayer games are really terrible places. I don't know if you've ever delved into that space, but it's extraordinarily unpleasant. And here's this attempt, but we're not going to, but what is it actually doing? You know, what are the ethical ramifications behind normalizing these kinds of things even more in an attempt to solve them? And even if you could go into this software and go and the only option is like, we're just going to cut it all out. You're not really solving larger problems either. Yeah. So it becomes to me, and this is a question I struggle with a lot. It's like, what are we actually solving as designers? Yeah. What is the fundamental core of what we do? And yeah, it's a massive question that I struggle with all the time, and not just with ethics, but around the entire purpose of, you know, the profession. You think about everything is design, you know, but how are we changing the world? You know, you hear all these grandiose statements, you know, we're changing the world, we're making things better for everybody, but you know, are we really? Are we not just adding to an enormous amount of clutter that modern life has become? Sorry, that felt a bit ranty. I didn't mean it to. And then just something else around context. Like this came up early on where people were talking about, you know, ethics meaning different things in different contexts. And I was just reminded, and this is an anecdote more than anything else, so take it as it is. I think it was 2019 or maybe 2018 was the last time I was at Design Indaba. I don't know if you're familiar with Design Indaba, big global design event in Cape Town. That didn't happen last year for obvious reasons. And every year they have this international student competition where students can enter from all over the world, and then a bunch of them get selected and they come to the event and they present their topic. And they're from all over the world. And what really, really struck me, now these are product designers in the sense of physical products, not UIs, was the preoccupations and the concerns of designers from, I guess, what we could call, you know, the first world, Europe, the United States, parts of Asia, and those from developing countries. The first world, I'll just use that term, they were all concerned about sustainability. It was all about repackaging, repurposing, zero waste, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The designers from developing countries were like, how do we give people proper sewage, you know, so they can go to the bathroom in their house? And it just struck me, you know, those kinds of, those you could say, well, those European or Australian or whatever, those are grand ethical concerns they have around sustainability, and that's fine. But when you come to a different context, you know, can we afford to have certain ethical concerns when people don't have running water? You know, yeah. Again, that's just like an anecdotal thing that struck me from attending that event, because that was really it was so strongly felt by when I was there watching all these presentations, how jarring that contrast was. Yeah.
I think you've picked up something interesting about ethics, though, just to jump in there, that ethics are bounded by and contained by the society in which they're established.
Exactly, yeah.
It's okay for a designer, for instance, in like Finland, to be thinking about like, what would you do with all these like well-educated kids with all that brain power? And it's also, that would be fair. It's also fair in South Africa to say like, maybe we just need classrooms.
Yeah, exactly.
And the tough thing, and I'm seeing this in sort of the global political sphere, is sort of the emerging markets being burdened with a bunch of conversations around sustainability when they haven't emerged into modern markets. So you hear this a lot, quite a lot from sustainability experts around the rise of the automotive, the personal car in India. We should discourage people in India from having cars because we know that that population is quite large, and therefore having cars would be bad for the environment. But we're also okay that America had in the 60s and 70s a mass drive to purchase cars for individuals. So it's a hell of a thing to grapple with, which that we're going to ask India to be more ethical and more sustainable than we ever were as the modern world. I think that will play itself out quite a lot, which is to what extent are we going to have to ask communities like to do something we didn't.
I think especially after we've kind of reaped the benefits of that already. I think this is also, but like, I think we're getting maybe a bit too like beyond the scope of this discussion, but yeah, no, I 100% agree with that sentiment.
Yeah, sorry, I didn't mean to derail.
No, I think it's a useful derailment because it brings into question the definition of ethics and justice. Is that they're located specifically in the society in which they arise. Like I was thinking now about the design practice. A lot of designers come from India at the moment, primarily in the software engineering space. And yet the conversations that are happening in sort of my peer groups in the US and the UK around ethics and sustainability and justice. But in India, we're okay with the fact that like that'll be a largely gig economy where we can zap like loads of labor and skill when we don't want you thinking about justice. We don't want you thinking about ethics. Yeah. Could you just write some damn code? So it does play itself out in our industry. Watch as our industry is tolerant of the fact that like we get low wage work from India. It's happening in almost all of our clients.
Yeah. It also happens in South Africa, you know, whereas people might be paid well here. They're extremely low paid workers doing work for US companies who would be paying 10 times what a US citizen as to what they're paying here. But because of the nature of the work here, you're relatively wealthy. Yeah. We need unions also. I'm just going to say that, and then I'll shut up.
I shared some great links about
why don't we have unions?
Yeah. Check out Tech Workers Coalition. I shared the link.
After all.
Barry, that's
guys, I've got to leave now. A great conversation.
That's okay.
Thanks so much.
Thank you very much.
Bye, Anu.
Bye.
Do you want to address Barry's question?
How do we feel about using darker game mechanics like scarcity and fear of loss of being used for good things? So like this is actually quite cool because you could pass there's some ethical tests that you can think about when you're designing things. Let me call them up and I'll just show you that. I'll just like discuss them to you. And then my hope is that this becomes like kind of beneficial to all of you, that if I do this, then like how I process ethical quandaries, then maybe you'll be like, oh, that's how ethicists do that. Is that okay? So I'll take Barry's example and I'll just give you some questions to think about from like an ethical standpoint. And we'll say like whether it actually is like good or not. And that may be like quite an interesting moment for us as a group. So like first, the utilitarian approach. Does this provide the most good or the least harm and diminish the least harm? Yeah, it does. So like passes ethics test 1. Barry, you're right.
Wait. wait, but if you're going to go according to like the theoretical like models, like I can punch holes in every single one of that.
Yeah, but Lizette, it's all subjective, right?
Yes, because
it's all subjective. So we use this in as much as it's useful to have a conversation. So we'll go through all of them, but one of them is going to have there will be a contradiction. So for instance, so virtue, the idea that we should be virtuous, this would fail that test because you're doing a dishonorable thing. You're using something that's bad. But does it do harm? So no, like it doesn't do that harm. It doesn't do harm. It maximizes benefit for some people. So this is the problem with like, this is the funny thing about ethics, right? If you go through kind of a systematic approach for discussing it, you tend to arrive at a few like really interesting positions on the same idea, but at least you're stripping you out of the question. Like this is what I hate about designers in most design conversations, is that they believe that their morality, their ethics, their belief systems actually matter. The only reason why I quite like going back to like kind of ethical schools of thought is like you argue from someone else's frame. You're like you're taking someone else's frame. Designers are meant to do that as a default, to reframe problems. So like let's treat ethics as a problem and reframe it. We can use framing exercises like taking different approaches to an ethical problem to have a cool conversation. So I'm not going to do the whole thing, but there are multiple schools of thought. And if you pass Barry's idea through it, my suspicion is you would pursue that project. Like you would actually say, okay, it's cool. It's going to do the least harm. The question, Barry, though, is does it have any unintended consequences that you can't imagine right now? Could you imagine a bad person using your technology for bad? And I imagine you probably don't have an answer for that now, but that would be generally the last question that I would ask you. Could you imagine if the worst person in the world, it's quite a fun exercise. Kenneth Bowles asked you to do this quite a lot. Imagine the absolute worst person in the world got a hold of your technology, whatever you were making, and you kind of imagine what they would do with it. What would happen as a result? And that's kind of a nice ethical acid test. So yeah, Bartis, the nuclear power option, right? Like again, Bartis is going to ask the hard questions because that's him.
So what you mentioned there, I heard someone refer to that as the Black Mirror test a while ago. So if you think of Black Mirror, the TV series where, you know, technology, usually everything goes to hell. So if it's exactly that. If you think about what's the worst way that someone can use my product, and the person who was giving this talk who used the example of very often in banking with joint accounts, only one person can access that, or you need one person to answer like the security questions. That can very, very easily be used for financial abuse, where one partner controls all of the money in the relationship. So we often don't necessarily think of like, what's the worst way that our projects can be used? And it's an important thing, because we might have the best intentions, but it's that thing again of, you know, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. Sorry, I interrupted you, Vincent.
No, that's okay. Like, I don't want to leave everyone with doom and gloom like that, because I have to jump off the call soon. Schalk's gonna have like I feel like I'm giving Schalk an existential crisis at this point.
Me? No, I've started my existential crisis like in my postgrad already. Don't worry.
Okay, that's okay.
Already way deep into it.
There are opportunities for us to use the same design process for good, right? So that's the thing. Like so we have done harm, but on the balance of it, designers have done much more good. There are more people in the world today with access to healthcare than ever before in all of society. There's more access to means for financial inclusion than ever before in society. Those are designers too. So that's awesome. There's more ways to connect and relate to people now in a globalized world than ever before. That's on us. Like during the COVID-19 pandemic, if you just think of how successfully Zoom scaled and allowed this to happen, like those are designers too. So we can make the right calls. I think one of the practices that I'm trying to do a lot of lately, and this is kind of my like final thought before I jump off of the call, is that Charles Eames in a lot of his work, I'm biased, I have his bloody quote tattooed to me. Yeah, that's how serious I am about design, that I've designers quotes tattooed to my body. Bit of a weirdo. he asks in The Power of X, which is a famous movie of his, and I'm sure if any of you have watched the Eames documentary, you would have seen the Power of X. It's a process of zooming to teach people kind of like exponents, so exponential thinking. And I won't talk about exponential thinking because that's weird. Please don't ever talk about that. That's like a weird like pseudoscience. But anyway, zooming is a practice I would love to see designers do as a default in all design practices. We tend to prematurely converge in the design process at the moment. I'm seeing this as like a really bad pattern in design. We get excited about a thing and we start narrowing really quickly. And the design process then becomes about like the human-computer interaction. Then it becomes like the login form. Then it becomes like the field in the login form. And suddenly we're obsessing, like design teams are obsessing about that. So in Charles Eames's work, he asked us to like look at that same process from different levels. Zoom out, imagine human in society, human species in society on planet, interplanetary things. That it's quite difficult once you go down that rabbit hole, but maybe the only practice that I can leave you with is when it comes to choosing stakeholders, widen the circle of who you choose to be participants in your processes. That's the most obvious and basic thing I can tell all of you to make ethics a little bit more of a reality. Here I play out one example of Airbnb not noting the unintended consequence of their design on the prices of homes in urban areas, prices and rent prices in urban areas. Had they simply thought about the bystanders of their design, they would have thought about the social consequences of that. It's possible for us to do that, right? Like it's a simple practice of mind. Zoom out when you're designing and then zoom back in. Constantly operate at 2 zoom levels, microscope and telescope, and you'll be okay. I think that's when good design does well. Then the last thing, I think there are some really cool practices emerging in society-centered and environmental-centered design. Both of those have websites. They're really cool principles for a modern design practice. I love them both. Both really cool communities. And to that, I'm going to say goodbye. And this has been really cool. I hope more of these conversations happen. In transition design, with Terry Irwin's great idea, we learned that niches are the best pockets or pockets of people are the best places to start transitions in society. Like I regard this space very highly for that reason. This space we're talking is shielded from the economics of our design. So it's in these kinds of places that we should talk about these things. Like have more of these. So thanks very much for setting up this space. I really enjoyed chatting to all of you. Goodbye, fellow panelists and other humans.
Thanks, Vincent.
Cheers, Vincent.
No worries, goodbye.
Yeah, I also need to start heading off.
Yeah.
But thank you so much for setting this up, guys. And I think the important thing to sort of be left with, I think, after this conversation, and in my opinion, is that we need to keep having these conversations because ethics is not a simple thing. There's no clear answer. And there isn't necessarily meant to be, but it's something that has to be discussed and has to be considered. And the more we're aware of it, the more we can have these difficult conversations with whether it's stakeholders or clients or co-workers, whatever it might be. But yes, so thank you so much. Sorry, my dog is freaking out. Thank you so much. It's been lovely chatting to all of you. Have a lovely evening further.
Thank you. Thank you for joining.